We're all too familiar with the constellation of election schemes and the inherent risks they posed, and they were never more apparent than in Michigan in the aftermath of the 2020 election. Jocelyn Benson unfortunately knows that firsthand. Weeks after the election, armed protesters descended on her home, calling on the Secretary of State and the Michigan's chief election official to launch audits and halt the certification of Biden's statewide victory. Never mind that there was no evidence to support such a claim. In that firestorm of misinformation and bogus legal claims, Benson became probably the national face in an effort to maintain public confidence in the bedrock of American democracy, free and fair elections. We thank Secretary Benson for being with us today, despite the extraordinary demands on her time, to discuss what the threat looks like, how she and her colleagues are across the country are approaching the challenge looming this fall, and how the 2020 experiences inform the plan for 2024. I also want to take a moment to thank Secretary Benson's staff, especially Angela Benander here, for the help and cooperation in organizing this conference and for recognizing the crucial role journalists serve in preserving our democracy. So please welcome Secretary Benson.
It's really exciting and great to be here with all of you today. Thank you for having me. Thank you for hosting this important gathering here in Michigan. We do know that the path to the presidency does run through our state, and with that comes all of the scrutiny, not just of the nation, but of the world on our procedures. People want to and deserve to know that everything we do is not just transparent and secure, but how we work every day to make sure that citizens can cast their votes with confidence that they will count, and also have that confidence that the results of the election, whatever they may be, are an accurate reflection of the will of the people. And so I'm particularly glad now to be having gone through this in 20, having gone through what we considered sort of phase 2 in 2022, which was an effort in, 2020 was when we first really saw just how far I think people would be willing to go to overturn a legitimate election and undermine people's faith and confidence in that election. 2022, we saw a strategy unfold that was really focused on targeting what was our strongest pro-democracy asset in 2020, which was the people who oversaw the elections process. You saw local clerks and statewide officials, secretaries of state, see challenges in 2022 from folks who were part of the, for lack of better words, Stop the Steal effort in 2020, trying to then gain control of the offices that we oversaw. In 2020, democracy prevailed because people of integrity on both sides of the aisle followed the law and stood by the facts, both in the administrative side in our world, at the legislative arena, and all the way up into Congress, and in the judiciary as well. And so it was no surprise, really, to any of us that we start to see an effort to replace those individuals in 2022. And it was very affirming that so many of those efforts to replace us failed, whether it was in Georgia and Brad Raffensperger's race in primary, or whether it was in Arizona with Adrian Fontes, or whether it was in Nevada with Cisco Aguilar, or here in Michigan. And so now we're entering phase 3 of this sort of three-act saga of defending our democracy in this really historical moment. And in my view, we're going to see two things happen. One, everything we've experienced up until this point is only going to be more than it ever has been before. Our battles will be facing a more sophisticated and organized foe. The misinformation will be more vitriolic than ever before, and perhaps even turbocharged with artificial intelligence. And the potential for violence and attacks on our election officials and intimidation and the potential for disruption is greater than ever before. We have for a long point, in fact, since January of 2021 and the tragedy that unfolded at our U.S. Capitol that day, on January 6th, we have seen this election, 2024, as what would likely be the culmination of these years of planting seeds, these years of planning, these years of trying to, in my view, really undermine the basic foundation of democracy in our country. We're now seeing that messaging start to play out writ large in the presidential campaign in a much more, it's come much more to the forefront in the recent week than it ever has up until this point. And so I think the bottom line is the story of the 2024 election will be one of democracy. It will be one in which our operations will hold in spite of an increased and more sophisticated coordinated effort to either undermine the operations or sow seeds of doubt about their integrity. And we will continue to see, I believe, all candidates talk about democracy in various different ways. And what both of those things give all of you is a massive responsibility to see things for what they are and cover them accordingly. What that really means also is to recognize what we are and what we saw in 2020 and what we're seeing again now and have seen every month and year since, which is that we are essentially, when we talk about protecting our elections or ensuring our elections run smoothly or certifying our elections or protecting or defending democracy writ large, we're really talking about sort of two things. One, making sure the infrastructure in operation holds, that every valid vote is counted, that our elections are actually legally certified, that those certificates of electors make their way to Congress in January of 2025. The operations are successful. But the second and equally critical and parallel track is the narrative. And what we saw in 2020 was that to the extent that efforts to actually break down the operations failed, the false slate of electors never made it to Congress. The efforts to block certification in our states and other states failed because they didn't get the votes that they wanted from the certifiers. That failed. Yet at the same time, the other parallel track, the narrative, was just as important to those trying to undermine the actual processes to have that succeed. And it was much more difficult for us as election administrators. We're not narrative experts. We are doing our jobs. It was much more difficult for us to figure out how to fight that narrative battle, which essentially was about calling things out for what they were. Battles over accusations of non-citizens voting are unfounded, and this is why. But also really to protect the minds of voters, just as we are trying to protect the operations of processes from being misled by this misinformation. And so we've talked a lot about how we're in this era of misinformation, and indeed we have been for the last several years. You all know that. But what that means is that you all have a greater responsibility than ever before to actually not become part of or used by those trying to promote a narrative that would achieve their goals of causing people to doubt the process and delegitimize democracy and government writ large, but instead stay true to not just the facts, but as you all do, but telling the story of the greater context in which something is operating. When the House of Representatives passed the Safe Voting Act, what is really going on there? Is it just they actually truly care about this legislation, or is it an effort to inject a conversation into the national discourse about the policies and the narrative coming out of that law? We all see that as more about the narrative than actually about the substance. We all have been training as election officials to be able to talk about not just the substance of our work, but also how it fits into a strategy around narrative. But we need help in making sure we are calling out not just challenges to the processes themselves, but what it means for the narrative that others are trying to promote around the sanctity and security of our elections. Excuse me. For some of you, I'm not sure if you're aware of my own background. I come at the Office of Secretary of State here in Michigan as having decades of work in the voting rights arena and field. I started my career at the Southern Poverty Law Center in Montgomery, Alabama, and would go often to the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma nearby to reflect on what had occurred in Selma in March of 1965. And from there developed a really deep sense of responsibility and inspiration. to continue the work of those foot soldiers that fought for and bled for a Voting Rights Act to be enacted in our nation. And through that work, I decided to become a lawyer, studied at Harvard under known election law experts like Heather Gerken, who's now at Yale, but many others as well, to really become steeped in the knowledge of what it meant to ensure our elections were strong and accessible and that people believed in them. That was actually 24 years ago, right around the time of the 2000 election, where we saw, for the first time really, I think nationwide, how one person, a Secretary of State named Katherine Harris in Florida, could impact the results of an entire presidential election. We saw her block a recount, create much confusion. Ultimately, that blocking of a recount was upheld by the US Supreme Court in Bush v. Gore, and our election law and presidential elections have never been the same. For me, that was a very formative, and for many who lived through that process, was a very formative time, because it showed me that all the work that we did to ensure we had a strong Voting Rights Act at the federal level, that voters knew how to cast their votes and do so with confidence, that we were there to use the courts, and the Justice Department was on guard in case there were any violations of the right to vote or voter intimidation, that all of that fell short if you didn't have an administrator, in particular at the statewide level, in particular in a battleground state like Florida was in that election, who is going to uphold the law and ensure the will of the voters prevailed, and was committed to that regardless of the outcome of the actual election. So for me, I began focusing more at that point on election administration. I wrote a book on the Secretaries of State nationwide in 2008, documenting Democrats and Republicans in their effort to actually rise above the partisan boxes that many of us find ourselves in, and define what it would mean to be a nonpartisan professional Secretary of State. And I hope you guys read the book, but if you don't, it basically came down to this question of whether we as election administrators are doing everything we can to increase access to the vote while simultaneously protecting the integrity and security of the process. And you can look, and at the time, although it's now become a tagline that many have used and misused, we called it making it easier to vote and harder to cheat. This idea of doing both things, that as Democrats are seen as oftentimes trying to increase access to the vote, and Republicans often seen as prioritizing security of the process. Good professional election administrators do and can easily do both of those things at the same time. And I've seen now colleagues on both sides of the aisle choose that more middle of the road bipartisan path, and others choose not to do it. But our job, particularly in battleground states, is trying to convey to citizens that everything we do to increase access to the vote is coupled with an effort to increase the security of the process. And I share that with you as to underscore how oftentimes covering our work as Secretaries of State can be, it can be easy to put us into one category or the other, but I would encourage you to look at clerks, election officials, and secretaries through the lens of, are they doing both? Because that's frankly our responsibility, to increase security, ensure the integrity of the process, while also ensuring everything we do increases access as well. One example of that, would be IDing voters, which is oftentimes an example and used in different arguments for or against election administrators. We all identify every voter before they get a ballot, whether it's a signature or an ID. The importance in what we've done in Michigan, for example, is to not just say that, but to make sure, to the extent that physical IDs are seen as one of the more, although I think there's data to dispute this, one of the more reliable ways of identifying someone. You can work to not just require IDs, but expand the number of IDs that are available. We've done that in Michigan, meaning you can now vote with a student ID or other types of IDs, tribal IDs. In the past, you haven't been able to. So expanding the number of IDs that are useful for voting and not restricting them, and also doing everything we can to get everyone IDs. That's something that a lot of us on both sides of the aisle have worked to do as a way to validate the need for identifying every voter, but also ensure that everything we do in that regard does not block an eligible citizen from exercising their fundamental right to vote. I can go into deeper detail about other aspects of that, our signature verification system to identify voters who vote from home, or our affidavit system in Michigan, where someone uses their signature to identify themselves in the rare circumstance where they don't have an ID in person at the polls. But all that to say is we want to identify every voter and also ensure that any identification requirements we place on them does not inadvertently cause someone who is eligible to vote to not being able to do so. You can apply that same analysis to voter rolls, which has become a particular focus in this cycle. How are we increasing and ensuring the accuracy of the rolls while also making sure that everyone who's eligible to vote is able to get on those rolls and then vote? That is the nuts and bolts of our work, trying to do all of those things together. And it's when you hear an election administrator talking about one and not the other that I would think you'd start to wonder if they truly are doing everything they can in a professional way to ensure the access and integrity of our elections hold. The other thing I'll mention, going back now to 2020, is some key takeaways from our experience that year about recognizing, in particularly, the role of misinformation in threatening our democracy and how much we need your help in reporting accordingly what we see. As I've alluded to already, we have been in the middle of this national, coordinated, and frankly well-funded attack on American democracy for several years now. And we saw the beginning of it in 2020. We're seeing the escalation of it, and I believe the culmination of it now. And in some ways, what we talk about and how we cover and how we report, what we're seeing now has to also be told in that greater context. This is not a scenario in which in August of 2024, individuals are suddenly deciding to file lawsuits or to pass new laws to damage citizens' faith in the democratic process. This has been ongoing now for a number of years, and it particularly targets not just voters' minds, but also the physical safety of election officials. New this year is artificial intelligence, of course, as you all know, which we've seen has extreme potential to confuse citizens. We in Michigan have passed 2 significant laws that a handful of other states, Minnesota, California, and a few others have also passed that are similar to what Amy Klobuchar and Josh Hawley have pushed for at the federal level, banning the use of AI to intentionally deceive citizens about their rights or about positions on candidates or things that candidates have said. Now, notably, that bill is narrowly defined, that ban is narrowly defined to still allow for the use of AI and other things regarding election communication. For that, there's also a second bill that requires disclosure of any images or videos that are generated through AI, and that disclaimer and disclosure requirement, we hope, will also equip citizens with information when they see something, knowing that it's fake, and being able to consume that information appropriately. So all of that said, the last thing I'll just mention as well, and then would love to hear from you in terms of your questions, is some of the best practices that we've really seen and need from folks in journalism all across the country and here in Michigan. In relation to everything I've just been alluding to, what we really need is for you all to become experts in the election laws that you're covering and the folks that you're covering as well. We have been, for example, and I know many of my colleagues are doing the same, providing media trainings for all of you to know ahead of time the details, the intricacies of how we verify voters' identities, what an e-poll book is, how we ensure only U.S. citizens are voting, and everything in between, so that as you report on others working in these areas or doing certain things, you have that greater context to tell that story. We also need your help in pre-bunking what we anticipate to see to be an onslaught of misinformation in the months ahead or in the weeks ahead. We believe, and we're seeing this play out, it'll focus in particular on this myth of non-citizens voting as a scare tactic and also as an effort to really put pressure on not just election officials and poll workers, but also voters as well. So the way this can play out, for example, as we get closer to the November election, is you could perhaps see challengers show up with a list of names. I'm saying this is a hypothetical. I haven't seen anything planned like this yet. But a hypothetical where someone shows up with a list of names of people who they believe are not citizens, for whatever reason, and then if those individuals show up to a polling place, they will challenge their eligibility. Those challenges will likely fail because it's likely that in this hypothetical that citizen is eligible, but what they certainly will do through those challenges is gum up the system, slow down the voting process, and create disruption in and of itself through those challenges, and create, of course, a sense of fear and anxiety among voters who may have a last name that some would wrongly lead someone to conclude they're not a citizen. And now they're perhaps afraid to come vote or participate, or if they hear this story from a family member, may think twice about voting either through the early voting period or on election day itself. That's the overall goal of these types of efforts of intimidation. And I say all that as a hypothetical to encourage you to kind of tell that story. This isn't just about someone showing up with a list of people and challenging their eligibility. It's part of this broader effort to sow seeds of doubt and cause fear and arguably intimidate citizens and make it harder for us as election officials to do our jobs, putting many poll workers in difficult positions as well as they have to stand up to individuals who are doing this. That example is one that we frankly have seen before in other elections. Long before I became Secretary of State, we would track these types of things as well. Because of the increased focus on, in particular, this question of non-citizens voting or somehow challenging the proposition that anyone but U.S. citizens are participating in our elections, we are anticipating in Michigan and perhaps in Arizona and Nevada and a few other places those types of tactics emerging, and that's the type of things we need to both prepare for, but also equip citizens with tools on how to address it as well. All that to say is we've got our work cut out for us in the months ahead, but we've got a strong record of success in that work here in Michigan, certainly based on 2020, as well as in the years since. The final thing I'll just say in that regard, and the other thing to keep an eye on as an inflection point going into our elections, is the post-election process. We really underestimated in 2020, as much as we were prepared for everything, just how far people would go in the post-election process, those 70 or so days between when the polls closed and the inauguration was held, to try to overturn or undermine citizens' faith in the results of that election. We fully anticipate to live through something like that again. And where it really starts and where the foundation really began was in that time in 2020 between when the polls closed and the unofficial results were announced. We know that window is one in which candidates will try to fill that void, while our election officials are diligently working to tabulate votes as quickly and as transparency and as accurately as possible. Candidates and other political figures will try to use that time to prematurely declare victory, to cast aspersions on the process. Why is it taking so long to vote? In fact, as an aside, when I host mock elections with students and I have them count votes, I intentionally give them a hard time, asking them why it's taking them so long to count, to demonstrate that it actually does take time and we have to respect that time and give them space as opposed to haranguing them. But we really do also need your help in that window, because the more citizens can understand what is happening in that window, that valid votes are being counted and every valid vote is being counted and only valid votes are being counted, and here's how. Here's all the redundancies we have in place to ensure that's the fact. The more we can spend the time talking about those things and less time giving air to candidates who are saying, I won because I have the majority of votes that have been counted so far, the easier it becomes in the weeks ahead to protect and preserve those results against efforts to delegitimize them. And again, we all saw that play out in different ways in 2020 and fully anticipate fighting those battles again in 2024. But thank you for being a part of this moment in history. All that said, where the work upon us is far beyond any particular election or candidate. It's really about preserving this promise of democracy for years to come and ensuring citizens can have rightly placed faith in the process and their voices and their votes. And our office will stand with you, ready to get you any information you need to know about that process. And I'm happy to make sure election officials in your districts, your jurisdictions all across the nation are similarly accessible to you so that we can get you the information you need to do your jobs.
Hi, Caroline Cummings. I'm a reporter for WCCO TV in Twin Cities. Cover state politics and government there, so I'm sure you know Steve Simon pretty well, our Secretary of State. Two questions. First, you kind of just mentioned the filling the void between polls closed and results where a candidate might declare victory because the counties that were counted might be more red or blue, and it makes me think about the language that, especially with TV, when you're on air, wall to wall, the language we use about taking the lead. I've always tried to avoid such language. I'm just wondering, one, if you can kind of comment on the responsible way to report as results are being tabulated, so as to not put in somebody's mind that it's like a horse race in real time, which it's not. And then two, broadly, your thoughts on like these election denier groups that are training poll workers, often with misinformation, but these are then the people that are going to go be the authority on the election process. How to approach that in reporting on those sorts of instances, and how do you feel about the kind of effort that's taken shape since 2020?
Yeah.
Sorry, a lot there.
No, on the second, I'm happy to talk about what we saw the poll worker infiltrating in 22. So happy to talk about what we did to protect against that. It was quite successful. And in 2020, or I'm sorry, back to post-election period. So I think in covering that, in my view, and I say this is like from an educator standpoint, there's a lot happening in that time period that goes far beyond like what the numbers say. This is where people are tabulating. This is how long they've been working. This is what they're doing to make sure that the votes are being counted. They're currently counting absentee ballots that have come in ahead of time. Now, just to kind of fill that time with actual descriptions of what's actually happening, which is you've got folks counting votes and tabulating, and the reason it's taking long is because we have many secure protocols in place to make sure that we're only counting valid votes and doing so in a transparent way. So I would, cover that process, go to an absentee counting board, talk about that, show throughout the night that it's not just, that something's actually going on. You're not just waiting for a phone call, and it's not just someone like in a room saying, I think 7, It's like an actual process happening, and the more you can cover that process and shed light on that process, the more we can also protect against misinformation proliferating through that process. For example, in 2020, in Detroit's absentee counting board, a media crew showed up at around 2 a.m. with a wagon of things, and observers saw that and said they're bringing in ballots. And that became this whole thing. At 2 a.m., they brought in ballots. At 2 a.m., they brought in ballots. It was a media entity, so they could easily be like, yeah, I know it's a camera. But at the same time, it became a thing, and then when you get candidates with high profiles and lots of influence repeating that, or Elon Musk this time around, it takes off and becomes its own thing. And so I think we can't avoid that from happening, but we can surround it with accurate content in the hopes that that gets amplified as well, and just really flood the zone as we kind of think about it with all of these details of the vast number of things that are going on in that time period. The other thing that we did in 2020 to help fill that time was give folks throughout the day good positive stories of things that were happening. This poll worker who's working in Detroit, she's been here 60 years and this is her 70th election or whatever, or these people were singing God Bless America outside a Macomb polling place as the polls closed, and really like cover those stories too, because there's a lot out there that I've found at least that are stories to be told that are really beautiful about folks who have volunteered and are working to protect democracy. And the more we can inundate, I think, audiences, for lack of better words, with those stories, it helps turn down the volume on the more egregious types of allegations that will undoubtedly be made in that time period. Secondly, with poll workers being trained to disrupt, in Michigan, what we did in 22, which we'll do again, is three things. One, we launched our own statewide recruitment program of election workers, and that we train both sides of the aisle and get them to local clerks to fill vacancies. Secondly, we work with local clerks to make sure as they hire people that they've got support to research those individuals they're hiring to see if they potentially have a propensity to disrupt. And provide any data that they may need, particularly in some local areas like Detroit or Flint, where you see people applying to be poll workers who have no connection to Detroit or Flint, doing a little background research, because these are employment contracts that people are gaining when they become an election worker, and we want to equip clerks with all the information they need to make a smart hire when they're choosing or hiring a poll worker. And then third, providing talent, as I look at it, with talented poll workers, helping research applicants who do apply for poll workers to identify who might be disruptive. 3, in every polling place, and we have 25,000 in our state, there is a senior election worker, poll worker in place that's been there for many years. And if anyone is disruptive, or they fall under the authority of the more senior election worker who's there in every location. And that enables us to also make sure there are people who we trust with more authority than anyone else in an actual precinct. And then 4th, we had every poll worker sign a code of conduct at the beginning of their work time as an election worker in the beginning of the day, so that if they violate that code of conduct, and we can get you an example of what it was, we can get you a sample of it, if they violate that code of conduct, they can be removed by their supervisor. So that created also a bright line of what disruption meant if someone tried to disrupt. And we only had a few instances of that, because we just, by doing all of that, we made it really very difficult for anyone to be disruptive. And we're also just very clear, and I said at a press conference the night before the election, like, if you guys try anything, it's not going to succeed, you're going to be removed, and you might even face criminal prosecution if you break the law. So I wouldn't risk it. And as a result, we were able to deter anyone from really significantly disrupting anything and quickly remove them if they did.
Yes, Stu, when you talked about News Watch, in 2021, Mike Lindell, I'm sure is one of your favorite people, came to Sioux Falls and did a cyber symposium.
I remember.
It was a multi-day affair, and pledged $1 million to anyone that could prove his data to be inaccurate, which someone promptly did, and he refused to pay, and it's got to tied up in the courts now. But that kind of sparked a little bit of, not a little bit, but a lot of electoral activism in South Dakota. There's a group called South Dakota Canvassing that said they were inspired by Lindell. They began sending open records requests to every county auditor in the state trying to get cast vote records. Didn't exist in some counties or wasn't available in some counties, buying voter rolls from the Secretary of State's office and looking for abnormalities, and immediately citing fraud if they found it. But I wanted to zero in on one thing that they're also doing to get your response on, and that is the demonization of drop boxes, which have now been essentially outlawed in South Dakota. I know that's certainly not the case in Michigan. Insufficient cameras, chain of custody issues. I was just wondering if you could address why Michigan, what Michigan has done to ensure its drop boxes are secure for elections.
I would say 2 things. One, we use the full force of the law to anyone who, to communicate to anyone who would interfere with the drop boxes or try to, put things in them that aren't supposed to be in them, or, that they would be held accountable under the full force of law. So that's a deterrent. Secondly, every one of our drop boxes has some sort of security footage and is under constant surveillance, even if it's a basic surveillance, and to make sure people know that surveillance happens and exists, and if they try anything, they'll be watched and caught. And then third, they're checked daily. And there's a requirement in the law that they be checked daily, and so that you don't have a situation in which a drop box is just sitting out there, no one's monitoring it, and no one's checking it. And then finally, we are mindful of the fact that violence or disruption at drop boxes, as we saw in Arizona in 2022 with armed people showing up to a drop box, is used oftentimes to send a message of intimidation to deter people from using them. And so we talk about that as well and say, like, look, we might, if there is any disruption, we will see you, we will get you, and we will consider that voter intimidation, so don't even try it. But if you do, our Attorney General, we'll make sure that you're prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. That's helped us protect against any particular, knock wood, major issues at drop boxes in Michigan, but it's, I can't underestimate, and I know I'm familiar with your leadership in South Dakota, how important it is to have local election officials who can say all that and do all that and guarantee all that, along with lawmakers that help us get the funding to do all that, so that we can have this basic thing that helps us ensure ballots get returned on time in effect for everyone. And then I'll finally say, as a result of all that, the biggest challenge we have with drop boxes is people using the wrong ones, meaning I live in Detroit and I'm going to use an Ann Arbor drop box. You can't do that. And so a lot of our work has also been about just making sure people know that they have to use a drop box in their own community. And by talking about them so much in that way, it's somehow conveyed a message that they're secure, they're accessible, they're there for you. But frankly, having them monitored 24/7 is probably one of the most significant things we've been able to do to at least respond to suspicions and say, like, I mean, it's monitored, so we're watching.
Hi, Secretary.
Hi.
Magazine. I wanted to ask you about the voter registration agreement that the Small Business Administration has entered into with the state of Michigan.
Yeah.
It's a first-of-a-kind agreement, lasts until 2036. Obviously, getting as many Americans registered to vote is important, but on the other hand, Michigan does have some of the highest voter turnout in the country. Republican lawmakers have said this is electioneering. So I'm curious just if you can share more about the origins of the agreement,
Yeah.
your thoughts on the agreement, and just where you think it goes from there.
I am amazed. I am amazed that folks have seized upon this, as well as our partnership with the VA. As a point of contention, it is amazing to me because all we're doing is giving a URL code to this SBA for their website that someone visiting their website to start a small business can click on and register to vote in Michigan, if they're eligible to do so. That's it. That's it. No money, no resources. And yet it's become a source of congressional hearings and lawsuits and all these efforts to really just create more stories, to create the sense that something's wrong in Michigan, that we're doing something that we shouldn't be doing. All we're doing is trying to get folks who are eligible to vote, to meet them where they are, come into a different federal government website, like the VA or the SBA, and get their access to election information that way. It's the same thing we do with our sports teams, same thing we do with universities and community colleges. We help get students registered to vote when they are registering for classes. It's really no different than any of the other partnerships we have with many organizations that are all nonpartisan, that have all gone smoothly, and that have actually, frankly, helped us break turnout records and voter registration records in recent years. So I will proudly defend our decisions and work in partnerships with anyone, including the VA. To help small business owners and veterans get access to voting information. And one of the things that we said a lot of times in 2020 is that we endure these attacks, that people attack us at their own peril, because we're not really doing anything other than what we should be doing as election professionals. And every attack point, ultimately, we try to use as an opportunity to highlight that, and this is no different. That said, in conversations with colleagues, we know that the reason this is happening, as I sort of express my incredulity, is to deter federal agencies, to make us scared, deter other federal agencies or others from partnering with us, to register voters, to meet people where they are, and to help people get the voting information they need in an era of misinformation from official sources. And so our focus, frankly, is not just on preserving these agreements and continuing to meet people where they are and register veterans and small business owners to vote, get them information about voting in a nonpartisan, professional way, but also make sure it doesn't achieve, these attacks don't achieve what I see as their ultimate goal, which is trying to scare anyone, federal agency, state agency, sports leagues, from partnering with election administrators in a sincere, authentic effort to get trusted voting information to citizens. We're going to continue to build those partnerships. We hope that these types of attacks don't deter potential partners from working with us or other states, but I fear that that will be one of the ramifications, and frankly is probably one of the motivations behind this.
A quick follow-up, if I may, just briefly. Just to bring it back to my initial question, was it the SBA that had reached out to Michigan initially, or was it Michigan that had reached out just for the origins of itself?
I think it was the SBA who reached out to us, yeah.
Okay.
SBA reached out to us.
Thank you.
But it wasn't a surprise because we had already reached out and been working with the Veterans Affairs agencies and other types of things, so it wasn't seen as anything out of the ordinary.
Thank you.
Hi, Stephen Gruber-Miller with the Des Moines Register. Thanks for doing this. You've been talking about people sowing distrust in elections and how to preserve that trust. There are obviously voters out there with, for a variety of reasons, some degree of skepticism or distrust in the election process. I'm wondering if you could talk about your strategies for communicating with those voters, the security of the elections, and if you have ideas of similar strategies that you think we in the media should be looking at to communicate with those folks.
Yeah, one of the things we've tried to generate are other voices in addition to election officials, in addition to election administrators and elected officials, from being voices of trusted information. So faith leaders, business leaders, community leaders, and others who are trusted voices. Frankly, folks in local media as well, getting them the information so they can independently share things to different audiences, be they employees, customers, fellow worshipers at a synagogue or mosque or church, or anywhere else where spheres of influence may overlap. In building these trusted messengers, we actually started in January. We found we've also been able to give people something they can do about the misinformation and utilize their own networks or wherewithal to help inform voters and pre-bunk misinformation. And in addition to that, we have been, developing partnerships with various influential voices, influencers, sports figures as well, so that they can be these voices as well for information. And we just launched a Democracy Ambassador program that invites any citizen to be a voice for trusted information in their community. People who sign up for that, and they can do it on our website, michigan.gov/democracyambassador, get information and kind of a direct line to respond to misinformation as well, so that they can be committed to sharing trusted information about our elections in the months ahead.
Yeah, I'm not sure if this is working, but you can hear me. I'm Malachi Barrett from Bridge.
It is working.
Oh, there we go. Yeah, Malachi from Bridge. Good to see you. Similar to Stu's point, we've heard a lot of concerns locally about so-called ghost voters based on people obtaining the QVF and then doing kind of their own audits. And I think also in response to the RNC lawsuit in Michigan and other states that, basically find that we have, I think it's around like 900,000 or so non-voter, or what would it be, inactive voters, right? And I understand there's a process by which we, incrementally take people off the rolls who are dead or no longer live here. But I think it's around like 11% of our registered voters are non-active. So that just has created a lot of concern that I'm hearing from people about the potential for fraud there. And obviously people have kind of like run with that in one direction. But how are you navigating that? I mean, I understand there's processes in place by which you follow to clean the rolls, and we seem to be following the law in that regard, but just the potential that we have more people on the rolls than people.
Well, I think it's important for folks like Bridge and others to talk about how just because someone's on the rolls doesn't mean they get to actually vote. You actually have to vote, and there's a verification process as well to get a ballot, and your signature ID has to match and all the rest. So there's I think, part of an untold aspect of this story is that, one, let's do a deep dive into all the things that we've been doing since 2019 that wasn't done before that really got us to this situation, and why we were trying to do everything we can in the years since I took office to increase the accuracy of our rolls more than ever before, as you know. Secondly, however, making sure people understand that just because someone has a name on a registration list, that doesn't automatically mean they're going to be able to vote. Certainly if they don't exist or if they've passed away, we've got procedures in place to protect against voter impersonation, and when there are instances of voter impersonation, we prosecute them in the small number of times that happens. So I think that's sort of a sort of lots of words to say, essentially, we've got several layers of security and protocols in place to ensure that only eligible citizens are getting ballots and casting them. I think clerks can walk you through that process, and we can as well. What we need, I think, is more attention on that process so that the focus others seem to want to have on voter rolls as an effort to sow seeds of doubt can be addressed and responded to, not just by talking about everything we're doing within within what the law allows to continually, on a regular basis, increase the accuracy of our rolls, but also what we do to make sure only eligible citizens are able to get ballots and cast them.
Joseph with Politico. I heard you say you supported the Hawley and Klobuchar AI bill.
Yes.
So I also take from what you were saying that you think that the federal government in general is acting too slow on this. So on that,
not to put words in my mouth, but yeah. Yes, they are, and I've said that. Yeah.
Yeah, I was just piecing together. Yeah. So what more would you want the federal government to do? I'm thinking you're talking about the FEC, right? And what more can they do?
How much time do you have? I think, I mean, one, we need to pass these bills, these artificial, what we've passed in Michigan pales in comparison to what the identical language enacted in federal legislation would be able to do nationwide. So, states can only do so much in that regard for those protections. I'm grateful for Senator Schumer, who as part of his dialogue around AI and elections, and for the increased attention on it. But we need to see these bills passed. Secondly, and we've said ad nauseum, a dedicated source of federal funding to the states to cover federal elections, especially in this era of misinformation where we have to spend more money than ever before to educate citizens about their rights in the face of all of these efforts to confuse them, is really helpful. And it boggles my mind that it is such a heavy lift to ask the federal government for funds to support our federal elections that are the foundation for their entire leadership as well, especially as they're oftentimes leaders are not shy of criticizing the states for things they feel we're doing that they don't like. It would be great if they also saw the need to work with us as partners and help us achieve our mutual goals of ensuring secure and accurate elections and accessible elections. Third, I think the agencies, whether it's the FEC or the EAC, also need sufficient funding and teeth to be able to actually do their jobs that they were created to do. Time and time again, we see them not doing that, either because of political reasons or other types of factors that have led to inaction. That said, the EAC in particular has been helpful to a certain extent, but not nearly as much as it could be if it was fully funded and as robust as I believe the Help America Vote Act that created it intended it to be. But it all just cuts down to this question to our federal leaders. Do you want safe, secure, accessible elections or not? If you do, we're more than happy to give you a menu of things that you can do. They've done none of it, and it's really increasingly frustrating for all of us because it sends a message that they actually are just going to attack us but not do anything to help us. And I shouldn't say everyone is attacked, but it sends a message that that we're on our own, but that also they're going to watch and scrutinize everything we do. And it's really unfortunate because we'd be much better off if we were all just able to be partners in this mutual effort. And I hope we'll see more elected officials at the federal level recognize the importance of that partnership in the years ahead.
Thanks.
Hi.
Sorry.
One, two.
Hi, my name is Bree Feller. I'm with CNET. I live in New York, but I grew up in the Lansing area, so I still talk to lots of county clerks in Michigan. And, after 2020, talking to poll workers, they were burnt out, they were tired, and, not to stereotype, but we're still talking about a lot of little old ladies that are nearing retirement anyway. And, they're also worried about some nut with a gun coming in who's been misinformed and shooting up the place. And it's like, what kind of resource, you talk about the federal government giving the state resources, what kind of resources are you guys giving people at the county level who are the people actually on the ground and dealing with this and worrying about people coming into their office? Yeah. And has CISA been any help to you in helping them?
CISA has been helpful. What has been most helpful was federal funding through the CARES Act that enabled us to get close to $10 million distributed over the last several years for election security improvements, be it bulletproof glass or hiring security or hiring additional workers to ensure things go smoothly. We've also worked to partner with national organizations like States United and CEIR and others that have tried to provide training, de-escalation training, and other types of things for folks at the local level. And we've brought them into conferences so that they can build those relationships directly themselves. And then on top of all that, on day one of my second term, not literally day one, but in the first month of my second term, I called upon the legislature to enact, which they subsequently have, greater protections for our election officials. It's now a crime in Michigan to threaten an election official in their line of work. That alone has drawn a line in the sand that has given us additional tools to provide those protections or make people feel that they have those protections. And then on top of that, we've done a number of scenario planning exercises with clerks all around the state, with just about every clerk, from Traverse City to Marquette to Detroit to Grand Rapids and Flint, where we have brought law enforcement, first responders, and clerks together to go through different scenarios, tabletop exercise, so that we know and they know who to call, what to do if someone does show up armed and dangerous. As a result of those conversations, we will be, I don't believe this is announced yet, but we will be rolling out a panic button type of communication for every election worker, if clerks work with us to implement it in their particular voting location, to be able to text if something occurs, similar to what Georgia did in 2022, immediately reaching law enforcement, us at the statewide level, at CISA and other partners, so that we are aware of all times if there is something that comes out during an election moment, either on election day or in early voting, that there's a direct thing that someone can do right away from the safety of their polling location in order to report something and get law enforcement there right away.
Is that reportable?
Have we announced it? No, it's still. I would say we will imminently roll out a strategy to ensure election workers at every polling place have. There, you guys are looking at me like I shouldn't be. Sorry. And I've talked about this in other conversations. And we're piloting it this August, and we hope to have it in place by November.
And just a quick follow-up to that, dealing with the less scary but still a problem of the avalanche of FOIA requests that people are still dealing with. They don't have the manpower or the funding or the overtime. Are you guys helping out with that, or what are they supposed to do?
One of the things we launched this year was a portal for FOIA requests, where things that are made, because oftentimes they're also made to our office, and so once someone makes a request, it's actually everything put online at this portal so that everyone can access that. So if someone duplicates a request, we simply direct them to the portal, and clerks know that they can do that too, so that at the very least, once that information's out there, it's easily accessible and retrievable by others, and doesn't require the replication or the multiple requests for the same thing to have it, an impact of repeated work.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
Joey Kepley with the Associated Press. You often don't endorse candidates, and I don't believe you've endorsed a candidate in the presidential race. Is that something that you've intentionally, Michigan is going to be a close election. Is that something that you've kind of intentionally not wanted to do, not wanted to wade into that, because of your position, didn't want to be seen as partisan maybe? And I guess the second part of that question is, you did speak before when President Biden was here, you spoke before that. And I know when I asked you about that, you said, I'm here to talk about voting.
Yeah.
If, former President Donald Trump was here, would you hypothetically speak to
Sure.
Across the
I've said I will deliver the message I delivered at the rally with President Biden anytime, anywhere, to any audience. And it's a message simply trying to communicate to citizens of the power of their vote in this moment and the real implications of how they use that power for the future of our democracy. I have intentionally not and stayed away from outwardly endorsing candidates for president when I'm overseeing the elections. But at the same time, I have a responsibility as the chief democracy officer for the state of Michigan to communicate to citizens what I see as threats to democracy. And so that's what I've been doing and have done throughout my tenure and will continue to do in the months ahead. Thank you, everyone. Sorry I talked so long, but if you have any follow-ups, thank you. Any follow-ups, we have Angela and Sherry from my team here. They can get you the information. Happy to talk to you further about any of these things. So thanks.